Hi guys, so here's what we have been doing for the last lesson or two. We have been looking at classical theory with specific reference to, as I'm sure you can see from this tremendous board work, we've been looking at classical theory with specific reference to short-run Phillips curves, long-run Phillips curves, and anticipated inflation, the way in which this all links into the labour market, unemployment and inflation. So I'm going to work through this for you in a sort of step-by-step broken down version following this little intro. Hi guys, it's Economics here, and today I am going to start into the Year 2 course, and I have started this with my own students, and we're starting with monetary policy and financial markets. And so what I want to do today is to just go back and revisit what we did in Year 1 of OCR economics with regard to the classical theory, the whole notion of classical economics. So you'll recall, I'm sure, a few features of the classical economy. Predominantly you will be familiar, I'm sure, with the perfectly inelastic classical aggregate supply curve. You will also be familiar, and this is a very important point for what we're going to look at in the future series of videos, that wages and prices, and indeed all markets, are assumed to be fully flexible. So they will flex upwards and they will flex downwards in order to restore equilibrium in a given market. Now, what have we got here and why are we looking at it? So I want to run through the whole notion of using aggregate demand to attempt to reduce the level of unemployment according to what classical theory states with regard to assumptions we make about AS and AD. And then I shall go on in the next video to link this into Phillips curves. That would be the short-run Phillips curve and the long-run Phillips curve. So, without further ado, ladies and gents, let's just get right to it. So here I have classical aggregate supply curve, perfectly inelastic, AD curve, 1, creating equilibrium in the market at point A, price level A, and we're operating at the YN. Now remember, there's another distinction between the classical and Keynesian theory, YN being the natural rate of unemployment. So A finds us at the natural rate of unemployment, and you will know, I'm sure, that that natural rate is predominantly made up of people who are frictionally unemployed. In other words, they are between jobs, they're searching for jobs. And of course, one needs that kind of pool of labour, that fluidity in the labour market, in order that specific areas of the labour market do not get tight, which would force wages up and hence cause wage push pressures in the economy and then upwards and upside inflationary pressures. So, if we are a classical economist or a monetarist economist, we're thinking, right, well, let's increase the money supply in order to stimulate AD and reduce the level of unemployment. What will happen according to this theory? Well, AD curve shifts from AD1 to AD2. That's your normal AD curve shifting to the right as a consequence of some expansionary intervention, which in this case is expansionary monetary policy, which increases the money supply. AD shifts right, AD1 to AD2. Now, we are moving along this SAS curve, and the SAS curve, as I'm sure you know, is the short-run aggregate supply curve. And there'll be lots of these dotted in and around here, and obviously the higher they are, then the higher are the costs to the firm. So, or firms, or industries. So here we've got a short-run aggregate supply curve, and we move along that until this equilibrium point B. Now, we have moved obviously past YN to YB, and so we have an increase in the level of real output. And we are assuming here that that real output is being produced by people, not machines, and as a consequence, unemployment is falling and employment is rising. Now, what's happening here? Higher level of real output, more employment, but look what's happened to the price level. Price level has now jumped from PA to PB. Now what classical theory tells us is that this will happen for a period of time until workers realise, alright, prices are going up, my wages aren't going up, so if I want to buy the same basket of goods that I was able to buy 2-3 months ago, I need a pay rise. So they go to their employer and they ask for a pay rise. If successful, they will receive said pay rise, but that of course will push the firm's costs of production up. And so consequently, we move to a higher short-run aggregate supply curve, indicative of the higher cost of production, whereby we have this new equilibrium now right back at point C. And so the people who were benefiting from a short-term gain in employment, the firm suddenly finds, oh well, actually my costs have gone up, I can't afford to employ more people, and so we move back to this natural rate. And as you'll know, these deviations away from the natural rate, so this movement from A to B, these are considered to be, as I've highlighted there, ST, these are short-term or short-run changes. But in the long run, any attempt by the government or the monetary authorities of the day to boost the level of output beyond the natural rate simply leads to higher inflation. So if this were to happen again, I don't want to make the diagram too convoluted and congested, AD would shift right once again, we'd end up at AD3. We would have a temporary gain, but in the long term we would move back to this point here on a higher SAS3. So we would be constantly jumping up this classical aggregate supply curve. So in the long term actually, the only gain that you see here is a movement from A to C, and that would be D, so that would be E, so A to C to E. So the only change as a consequence of increasing the money supply in an attempt to reduce unemployment is actually unemployment just stays at the natural rate and you just keep bumping up inflation higher and higher and higher. Now that can't be good. And so that relates very clearly, ladies and gentlemen, related now to a theory which we do look at in year 2 and for which I have a previous video. That relates to our quantity theory of money where MV is said to equal PQ or PT. And of course you'll recall, I'm sure, that V and Q are assumed to be constant, and so a doubling of the money supply simply leads to a doubling of the price level. And this is what this is illustrating. Any attempts by the government, the monetary authorities, to boost AD and reduce unemployment simply leads to ever higher inflation rates. And these points, ladies and gentlemen, really are the only points, so we're talking A, C, E, these are the only points at which inflation is stable, because if you're moving in this direction, obviously you've got accelerating inflation. If you were, say, moving in this direction, so the monetary authorities decided to cut back on money supply to bring inflation down, then of course you have a disinflationary effect there. Inflation starts to drop. And so these points A, C, E, these are what we call the NAIRUs, which we use as an abbreviation for the non-accelerating rate of unemployment. The non-accelerating rate of unemployment, NAIRUs. In other words, A, C and E are the only points at which inflation is neither accelerating nor decelerating. And if you try to interfere with it, you'll either accelerate it or you'll decelerate it. But the point is that you'll always end up back at this natural rate. Now we can apply this very simple and basic principle to Phillips curve diagrams, and that's what I want to do in the next video. So I'm going to leave it at that, ladies and gentlemen. Probably a lot there for some of you to take in, and I'll be back with the next one, which will simply be an extension of this, but incorporating our Phillips curve analysis. Bye for now.